Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, beginning with verse 36 and going through verse 40. It says, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. In the course of my life, I have been inside a lot of different houses. Some of them as an invited guest, others as a part of ministry, giving a Bible study, making a visit. Some having to do with my business, and still others as a friend of a family member or something such as that. A lot of different houses. From the humblest dwelling to the most expensive mansion, I've been there. And everything in between, log cabins, mobile homes, brick houses, framed houses, stone houses, old houses, new houses, apartments, one-room shanties. I've been in all of them at one time or another. Perhaps you have too. In some houses that I went into, I knew just what my place was and what was expected of me. In other houses that I was in, I felt unsure and awkward, not certain where I should place my coat or whether I should take off my shoes or not. There were houses where I felt right at home and so comfortable you would have thought I was in my own house. And still others where I sat upright and self-conscious, fearing that I would do something or say something that was wrong. The truth is that if you really, really want to get to know somebody, get inside their home. For it is there that you will find who people really, really are. There are very few people that aren't themselves in their own home. If they're not, I don't know what to say about them. Because home is where you really, really live. Am I right? It is. Home is going to tell you about the person who lives there. And as a matter of fact, you can also find out a lot about yourself when you are in somebody else's home. When I was 20 years old, I worked at a summer camp in Colorado for the summer to earn, tuition money for my school. And my older brother and his family, he had two girls, wife and two girls. They lived about 30 miles from the camp there in Colorado, down in Boulder. And on my days off, we got one day off a week, I would go down and spend the day with them. And then when the end of the camping season, the summer camping season ended, I went and spent a few days with them before I left to go back to Union College to begin my fall semester. It's just like Cohutta Springs, except it was in Colorado. Well, that last weekend that I was there, we had gotten invited, that is my brother's family and myself, we had gotten invited to the home of one of the church members there in Boulder, and it was for Sabbath dinner. And so we arrived there at the house. It was a nice house, and they were nice people. But I should warn you that my brother, about 5 years older than me, he had, he did not have what you'd call a diverse palate. In our words, we would say he's a picky eater. And he was. His idea of vegetables was corn and peas, and that was it. That was it. So when we arrived there, our gracious host began to bring out the food, and first thing she brought out was a squash casserole. And then she brought out an asparagus dish, followed by sweet potatoes, and then there was some kind of loaf of some sort. And I watched and saw the beads of sweat starting to form on my brother's forehead. I knew what he was thinking. Now, I didn't have a tremendously diverse taste above and beyond my brother. I was somewhat better than him, but I knew how to pretend it better than him. So I said, okay, I'm gonna eat this. I'm gonna enjoy it, or I'm gonna look like I enjoy it. And my only prayer was, let me serve myself. Please don't you serve me. I want to control my portion. Well, the saving grace of that meal was the homemade rolls that came along on the table. I'm not sure I would have made it without those. I probably would have been exposed myself. But not so for my brother. He couldn't do it. After about 6 rolls, the gig was up. And his wife, my sister-in-law, had to confess, he's not going to be able to finish this. He won't be able to eat it. What an awkward situation. Embarrassing? Yes. Did my brother feel terrible? You bet. Was the hostess gracious? Absolutely. From all that I could tell. So we laughed. What else could we do but laugh about it? And then ice cream for dessert helped to soothe some of the awkwardness. But that was a meal that I'll never forget. Never. I don't know if that meal was typical of that family or whether they were, making it special. But as far as the food was concerned, we didn't fit. It was not what we would be eating in our home if I was back where he lived. When we enter somebody's home, we leave the make-believe and we come instead into the real. To the extent that what we see there is typical for that home. For good or for bad, we are who we really are when we're at home. You might not guess it from just one visit. Probably not. We usually like to put on airs for somebody. Stay there for a while. The real will come out. Home is a place where it doesn't always smell good, but sometimes it smells wonderful. A place where sometimes it's very loud and sometimes it is blissfully quiet. Home is the place where we are most likely to shed our tears and most likely to laugh until it hurts. That's what home is. But home is also the place where many of us, many people have experienced some of their deepest hurts, their most humiliating put-downs. Who we are this morning is a reflection of what our home life is or was like. Now, it's possible to have a poor home life. We all know that. But in general, when we think of the word home, it's supposed to be a positive term, correct? Someone said, in this home, we do second chances. We do real. We do mistakes. We do I'm sorries. We do loud really well. We do hugs. We do together best of all. I like that definition. Another one says, I believe that all of our lives we're looking for home. And if we're really lucky, we find it in someone's loving arms. I think that's what life is, coming home. If you were not blessed with a wonderful home life, you can be sure that whether you know it or not, you're trying to reach the home that you didn't have. I believe that's true of everyone. And so for our purposes this morning, I want us to use the term home. When we think of home, we think of our individual homes, but I want to use it as an analogy for the church. You know, we've been preaching a few sermons about life in the church. What does it mean to be the church? We've talked about a number of things. Unity. We've talked about the role that shame can play in our lives and how the church is designed to help remove that shame. You know, the Bible has a great deal to say about houses and homes. A great deal to say about it. Look up a concordance someday and see how many times the word home or house is found in the Bible. Hundreds of times. Most of the Old Testament speaks of homes as the dwelling place of individual families. Houses and homes is where individual family units lived. The temple, or the sanctuary that preceded it, was the dwelling place of who? Of God. That was God's house in the Old Testament. That was where God dwelt. But in the New Testament, there's a radical change regarding this description. Gone is the temple, and instead we read of a new arrangement. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through the first half of verse 5 says, "As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house." You all, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house. So here the church is likened to a house. We go further. 1 Timothy 3:15 adds to that by saying, "Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church." So in this setting, the church, which obviously is people and not a building, is called God's household. Now, at this time, there were no church buildings or church property. Believers were meeting in homes. There wasn't a sign somewhere that said Church of Thessalonica, 1 mile down, turn right. Didn't exist. What was behind all of this? What was this new wine that could not be put in old wineskins, to use Jesus' words? In the Old Testament, again, God's dwelling place was identified with the sanctuary. Exodus 25, verse 8 reminds us that when God was speaking to Moses, he told him, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them." It was to the temple that devout Hebrews prayed, and it was in reference to the temple that Solomon, in the dedication of the sanctuary that he built, said, "May your eyes," speaking to God, "be open towards this temple day and night, the place of which you said you would put your name there. May you hear the prayer your servants pray toward this place." Now, this can kind of help us to better appreciate this change that took place as a result of Christ's ministry, where he said in Matthew 18, verse 20, talking to his disciples, that very famous text we all know so well. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am with them. Location is not mentioned. Location is not critical here. This is what Jesus was trying to get across to the woman at Samaria, the Samaritan woman at the well, when she asked him about location. Which mountain? Which mountain is the place to worship God on? And Jesus said, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. So, in the New Testament, there is a transfer from location where God dwells to a people in whom God dwells. Do you see that? Okay? What am I getting at here? A transference from location where God dwells to a people in whom God dwells. It is perfectly appropriate then to speak of the church, that is the believers, that is you and me, as the house of God. And by extension, whatever building or home we worship in, as our church home. Okay? Church home, the household of God. Christianity forgot this truth as the decades turned into centuries. In time, the home concept gave way to buildings, and buildings gave way to bigger buildings, and bigger buildings gave way to great cathedrals, where people were segregated into classes, much like the Old Testament temple. You can come this far, no farther. Someone will mediate before God in your behalf. I'm not against church buildings as such, but if we think that by getting bigger and more ornate and more formal and more austere is pleasing to God, while forgetting that wherever two or three are gathered, this is where the living temple is found, we're blind. And Christianity, to a great degree, has blinders on, if you look at its history. You see, having said all this, there's something about the great ancient cathedrals that allures me. It awes me. Have you ever been to one? The sheer immensity, along with the artwork and the gigantic scales of size, the ceilings, and so on and so forth. It captures my imagination. But I must confess, inside one of those, I am not captured by the idea that God is immanent and that He's come close to us and near to us and wants to dwell within us and among us. I think of the transcendence of God, the otherworldliness of Him, the fact that He's so different from us and so great and grand. And we shouldn't lose that, don't get me wrong. But cathedrals miss the New Testament's emphasis that the church is the house of God. The church is the home. Cathedrals remind us that only certain people can go into the deepest recesses of the building. Indeed, there are ropes and railings to help us all remember that there are lines that can't be crossed by the ordinary worshiper. Cathedrals don't feel like home. They're wonderful to view, but they don't feel like home. This is a retreat into Old Testament theology, and that denies the truth, I believe, of this New Testament transformation. So let's talk about the analogy between what home means to us individually and what we mean by the church being our home. I said earlier that the home is a somewhat of a sacred place for us. It is where a person lives their most authentic life. It is where there is little and perhaps even no pretense. Everybody sees who each other is. So, rightfully speaking, when someone invites you or me into their home, they're doing one of the most generous things that they can do, and perhaps one of the most intimate things they can do. I want you to come into my home and see me and be a part of my authentic life. I want you to come into the place where I live, where I dwell, where I spend the most intimate moments of my life. Acts 16 tells the story of Paul and Silas' first visit to Philippi. Now, it says they went to a river on the Sabbath because they reasoned that that's where prayer would probably be made on a Sabbath morning. And sure enough, they found several women gathered together for a Bible study and a time of prayer, perhaps. And one of those women, her name was Lydia. She was probably middle upper class. She was a dealer in purple cloth, which was the kind of cloth that wealthy people wore. But it says that the Holy Spirit opened her heart to hear the gospel, to hear Paul's message. And then she said, in verse 15, it says, when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. This wasn't to impress Paul with whatever niceties she had in her home, its furnishings. It was to provide Paul and Silas with a place of safety and comfort and fellowship. Come into my home. Let me provide a place for you. Jesus himself was not immune from this kind of place, this kind of setting where he could put up his feet for just a little while, so to speak. Whatever you think of Martha, in comparison to her sister Mary, there's one thing you ought to remember about Martha. In Luke 10:38, it says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. I love that phrase, opened her home. I want to open the door to the place where I really live, and I want you to come in, and I want you to experience the comfort and the rest and the sense of belonging that I have in this home. She opened her home to Jesus. Yes, she lost perspective. She focused a little too much on the preparations instead of the guest. But she still opened her home to Jesus. You see, when someone invites or opens their home to someone else, it should be a gesture of kindness and an appeal that I want you to be comfortable here. I want you to be blessed by being in my home. And we even use that term. We use it a lot. Do we really think about it? When someone comes in, please make yourself at home. Please make yourself at home. But it doesn't always work that way, does it? I have been at homes where at least in one room, and sometimes all the rooms were like this, believe it or not, where all the furniture was covered in plastic. Been in a home like that? I'm not going to ask whether your home has any plastic-covered furniture or not. But I've been in homes that the furniture's covered with plastic, clear plastic. And I understand, probably it's because we don't want to wear the furniture down or out. We don't want it to get dirty. Do you think the guest thinks that way? What do you suppose comes into the guest's mind when he comes into a home and the furniture's covered with plastic? Ooh. Think that gives them the sense of comfort? I can be myself here? No. No. You can't move on a piece of furniture like that without making a sound. It's awkward. It's awkward. Your and my interpretation probably is, ooh, they probably don't want me sitting there, and if they do, I better be overly cautious that I don't spill anything or knock anything over. Plastic-covered furniture does not make you comfortable. Plastic-covered pews don't either. I'll get to that in a minute. Turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 7, will you please? It's where our scripture came from this morning. We have only read a portion of it. Now, it's interesting. There are several tellings of this story, or one like it, in the other Gospels. It could be that this experience happened more than once in Jesus' ministry. And in Luke's account in chapter 7, beginning in verse 36, it says Jesus had been invited to the home of a Pharisee, whom later on we learned had the name of Simon. In Matthew 26, verse 6, in a very similar story, Simon is identified as a leper, but not as a Pharisee. In John chapter 12, Mary, the sister of Martha, is identified as the woman who broke open a bottle of perfume and anointed Jesus' feet with it. But in Luke's account, this woman has no name. It's as if each gospel writer took different parts of this one story to emphasize whatever point they were wanting to make. Now, in Luke's telling, Jesus, as a rabbi, as a teacher, is invited into Simon's home. According to William Barclay, the houses of well-to-do people at that time were built around an open courtyard in the form of kind of a hollow square, maybe. And often in the courtyard there was a garden and perhaps a fountain. And in the warm weather, that's where meals would be served and eaten. Now, it was the custom in the East that when a rabbi was at meal in such a house, that all kinds of people would come. And being outside, they were quite free to do so, to come in and listen to the teacher. That would explain how this woman got in. I guarantee you Simon didn't invite her. And when a guest would come into a home like this, three things always were to take place, particularly if he was a rabbi. One, the host would place his hand on the guest's shoulder and would give him the kiss of peace. Secondly, there would be cool water brought to wash and soothe his dusty feet. People wore just sandals, their feet got dirty. And the third was that it was either a pinch of sweet-smelling incense was burned or a drop of the water from roses would be dropped on the head or placed on the guest's head. These are what good manners demanded in a setting like this, okay? Now, in the case of Simon and his guest Jesus, none of these things were done. Not one of the three happened. Jesus didn't receive the kiss of peace. His feet were not cooled and soothed by water, and he was not given incense or something sweet smelling over his head. So, this woman, who simply, it said, lived a sinful life. You have to remember, they were reclining. It's as if the table was in the middle, and instead of chairs, there were like little benches, and you would lean on an elbow with having one hand free, with your head facing the table, your feet would be out the back. And so the woman could then get up behind Jesus where his feet were and pour the perfume on his feet or wash his feet and dry them with her hair without being unduly noticed. But of course, Simon noticed it. And in his own mind, now this is an interesting, he said to himself, it says, if he's a prophet, he would know who's doing this. And by implication, he wouldn't let her do this. She's a sinner. And interestingly enough, Jesus, who read his mind, apparently, or perhaps the look on his face, told him, Simon, I've got something to tell you. I've got something to tell you. And Simon says, okay, tell me, Master. And he goes on to talk about teach him a lesson, and everybody else that was there, about what true love is, about what true gratitude is, about what true forgiveness is. And Simon, who really didn't have the comprehension of his need, was at least smart enough to recognize the one who has been forgiven the most is the one who's going to love the most. But what's interesting here is that Jesus remarked to him, you know, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet. But she wet my feet with her tears, wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. The point I'm wanting to get to here is the setting that Simon the Pharisee invited Jesus to his home, correct? Was the purpose for Simon inviting Jesus so Jesus would feel comfortable, so that Jesus would feel at ease, so that he would feel like they really wanted him there? It wasn't, was it? It was everything that was wrong about opening your home to somebody. It wasn't where Simon understood his own authenticity. It's where Simon had multitudes of secrets in his own heart and in his own life, and Jesus saw them. So two things come to my mind as we're getting ready to close here. The first is, both of them are in the form of a question. The first one is, how comfortable do you feel in this your church home today? Think about it. Do you feel like you can be who you are? Really? If you're saying yes, then that is wonderful. Because if that's true, then you understand what church home really is. You feel at home here. Do you feel part of this home? Can you be who you really are without fear or awkwardness? Do you feel that you belong here? And the second question is like unto the first. How comfortable do you feel inviting others into your church home? How comfortable do you feel opening this home to others? Now, the second question is going to be based on how you answer the first question. How comfortable do you feel in this home? How comfortable do you feel inviting others into this home? Are you comfortable having strangers enter the doors of your home? Do you really mean it? Do you and I really mean it when we tell people to come just as they are? And I want to clear up one more point before we close. I've heard some say during my life that they get a little uncomfortable with this idea. We just can't invite sin into the church, can we? That's not going to please God. What you seem to be advocating, Bruce, is that anyone can come, no matter what they bring in with them. What about preaching about sin, about calling it out? Well, number one, that's not the way to get people to come into your home. All right? I am saying that anyone can come into this church. Anyone. The only prerequisite that I am assuming, without even asking them, is that they are a seeker. Now, a seeker is anyone who feels some sort of need, any sort of spiritual need, be it ever so small. I want them here, don't you? Amen. Are we prepared to have them here? Do we really want to open our home? You see, there'll be plenty of time once they come into the house to talk about the rules of the house, for all houses and homes have them. But you and I must assume that God is speaking to them in some way for them to even be here. Why else would they come? We're not talking about people who have evil motives in mind. We're talking about people who have hurts, we're talking about people that are trying to find home. They just don't know where it's at. So there's a few distinguishing marks of a church home, of an individual home too, because the connections are so close. First of all, a church should be welcoming. How many of you have welcome mats on your door in front of your house? Welcome, welcome. Church should be welcoming. People know instinctively whether or not you want them to be here. Whether or not you're happy that they're among you. They know it. Secondly, a church should be warm. There should be no rough edges, no sharp edges in this home, no awkward furniture, and no places where, I better not touch that, or I better sit up straight, I better behave, I better act in ways that I wouldn't act otherwise. Attractiveness is not a bad word to use when you're talking about a church home. You want them to say in their hearts and in their minds, is this a place where I can heal, where I can grow? Is this a place where I can find something, where I can find help? Is this a place where I can find people that have stories kind of like mine? The third thing, a church should be worn. W-O-R-N. We don't put plastic on our pews. And we shouldn't be overly concerned when we see a worn spot. Pews can be replaced. People can't. A house is a place where you live in. And a house shows that it's been lived in. We even use that term. Boy, this place has been lived in, hasn't it? Church should be worn because that's what makes people feel comfortable. No things are off limits. We're not talking about being disrespectful. Don't get me wrong here. But people gravitate to real life and real people and real connections. Amen. That's what draws them. A church should be a place where wholeness can be found. Church should answer the questions, is it safe for me to be here? Is it safe? What if they found out what I'm carrying inside of me? What if they found out what I think sometimes? What if they found out what I'm struggling with? What if they found out what I did last night? Is it safe for me to be here? Is this a judgment-free zone? Is that what the church is? Is this a place where, because it is safe, now I can grow and begin to deal with God and with others with those things that I'm carrying inside of me? Will I be shamed here? Can I grow at the right pace for me here? Or are they going to lay on me some heavy expectations as soon as I sign up? Finally, the church should be the place where the way is revealed. Every house has rules. Every home has rules. I don't know, have you ever been to a home that was no rules whatsoever? Maybe you have. Maybe chaos was the rule. Our rule is we don't have any rules. Those usually don't work out, do they? Our church home has rules. We can call them commandments if we want. We can call them standards. We can call them the ways that we behave with each other, whatever you want to call them. Those rules should be reasonable. They should also be biblical, and they should answer that question, is truth taught here? Our main job is to introduce our visitors and guests to the owner of this house. His name is Jesus, and he doesn't charge rent. As a matter of fact, the mortgage for everybody has been fully paid. 1 Peter 1:18 says, "For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but he was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God." The owner of the house, that's the first rule. That is the first rule. That is the primary rule. We want you to get to know the owner of this house. We all love living here. We want you to love living here. And the owner of this house is simply amazing. The good news is that the doors to this house are always unlocked. In fact, the door is open and slightly ajar. It's not closed to you. It's not closed to me. It's not closed to anyone else. And the Spirit and the bride say, "Come." And let the one who hears say, "Come." And let the one who is thirsty come. And let the one who wishes take the free gift of the water of life. Open the door. It's not locked. Come in. I said earlier that everyone's looking for a home. Most don't know it. If we don't model a healthy home life as a church, it will make the search that much harder for them. Some might give up the search or seek to find it somewhere else. This really does work in real life. I came across a story that just kind of struck me as I was thinking about this particular point. It goes back a little bit, a generation or two, but I see a lot of people will remember this. There was a famous actress in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s named Joan Fontaine. She had another famous sister who was also an actress, whose name was Olivia de Havilland. Both of them were actresses. She wrote this story about her life. I want you to listen to it. Most of us move through life looking for something. For years, my search was for a sense of belonging, truly belonging somewhere. I spent half a lifetime looking for a place where I could feel deeply at ease, accepted, part of a family, surrounded by people who cared. I had begun to believe that no such place existed, and then I found one. I'm sure the origins of my search go back to my childhood, when ill health and the isolation that it brings played such a large role in my life. My mother told me that I spent the first 2.5 years of my life wrapped from head to toe in cotton bandages due to the eczema that covered me. My father, Walter de Havilland, was a professor teaching at the Imperial University in Tokyo, where I was born. Mother always believed that the goat's milk that is given to babies in Japan started me on my endless succession of ailments. My parents' marriage was not a happy one. When I was 2.5, Mother, my sister, and I left Japan and settled in Saratoga, California, where doctors assured Mother that the climate would be healthier. It was true that my eczema got better, but just about every other conceivable illness followed. My earliest memories are of tastes, castor oil, Scott's emulsion, and the hatefulness of unsweetened licorice cough syrup, and of white uniformed strangers bending over me with long, hurting needles. I suppose it was no wonder that with such handicaps, I found it hard to relate to other children. And indeed, the life we led was different from other children's carefree existences. By now, my mother had remarried. My stepfather was an investment counselor, but I'm sure he should have been a general. The bedroom my sister and I shared, which when I wasn't quarantined with some infection, was modeled after a barracks. Khaki spreads on iron bedsteads, khaki-painted furniture against dun-colored walls, military-style inspections morning and night. At his insistence, every Sunday we wrote out the schedule for the week ahead in precise segments. 7 to 7:15, bathe and dress. 7:15 to 7:45, breakfast. 7:45 to 8:15, make beds, tidy room. 8:15 to 8:30, walk to school. And so on through the long, regimented day. My stepfather was a well-intentioned man, and I respected him, but he was unable to give the warmth, the open affection, and understanding touch that I yearned for. And yet all the illness and isolation and regimentation had their compensations, for instead of real companions, I found my friends in books and in the dramatic sketches Mother taught my sister and me to act in when friends came to visit. On days when I was unable to sit up in bed, I would weave long, thrilling dramas in my head. Little did I think at such lonely moments that I was going through the perfect apprenticeship for an acting career. But apparently it showed to those around me. One day, a friend of Mother's who had seen our little living room drama received a call from the actress May Robson. May was looking for a young girl to play the role of an actress in the next play. "Joan de Havilland," said Mother's friend without hesitation. And so I found myself in the wonderful make-believe world of theater. By now, my sister was an established actress, so in order not to trade on her name, I took our stepfather's name, Fontaine. Acting was a strenuous career for a girl as sickly as I was, but I soon came to know why someone else called it Dr. Theater. Because no matter how I felt or how high my temperature, when the curtains parted, a burst of energy always flooded into me, and I went on oblivious to everything but the part I was playing. My increasingly successful movie career had many rewards, but it did not bring me the warmth and close relationships that I kept seeking, sometimes desperately. Perhaps it was the lack of a warm father figure in my childhood that made my expectations of marriage so ridiculously high. My husband was to be everything I had longed for as a girl, all loving, all strong, all wise. He would be the answer to my every need. And each time he fell short of those expectations, The disillusionment was keener, the depression that followed more serious. Each time I felt as if I were a wanderer with no place to go, no place to belong. It was during one of these bleak times in 1972 that I finally realized what I had been doing. I had been idolizing human beings, trying to make of them what flesh and blood can never be. Even if a man could be the father I dreamed of, the brother I never had, he could never be God. Of course I wanted a century in my life. Of course I wanted perfect faithfulness, perfect love, only I had been looking for those things in the wrong places. I remember so well the day sitting alone in my New York apartment when that realization came to me. I remember it because with it, quietly and clearly, came the answer I had been seeking for so long. Not far away was a tranquil place of worship called the Church of the Heavenly Rest. I began to attend services there. A few months later, I consulted the rector, Burton Thomas, and told him I needed to be baptized. With just a few friends to stand with me and Dr. Thomas's wife, Hazel, as my godmother, I was baptized, and I knew that I had found the place where I belonged at last. Baptism acts like an inrush of grace, she said, and grace changes people. Have I changed? I believe so. Where I was judgmental and sometimes too demanding, I now feel more sympathy for other people, more tolerance, more understanding. My friends who seem closer and dearer tell me that I seem closer and dearer to them. I feel stronger in myself. I'm not looking so desperately for some other human being to lean on. I belong to a church, and a church belongs to me, and I feel surrounded by love and joy. Sometimes I wonder why it took me so long, and then I think of that marvelous parable of the workers in the vineyard and remember that in God's sight, there is no soon or late. In that story, each worker received the same reward no matter when he came. For me, that reward was the gift of knowing I belong. This is not about perfection this morning. This is about being authentic, genuine, the real deal. This is about helping others find the comforts and the safety of home and where we also find that same peace. This is about living the love of God in Christ and sharing the love of God in Christ. And when we do that, we will find that there is truly no place like home.
Would you stand